Well, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet officially release tomorrow, and I haven't really taken the time to really go over my thoughts on these games, so I thought it would be a great time to just sit down and talk about how I'm feeling about this generation, before we all have the opportunity to have these games in hand by this time tomorrow. So, let's get into it.
So let's start off with the thing I'm always most excited to see, which is the new Pokémon being added this generation. And honestly, I've been a bit let down with what's been revealed so far. While I think a lot of the designs that have been shown off have been really great, I feel like they've mostly been early game Pokémon, and we haven't really seen a lot of fully evolved Pokémon yet. It really feels like they're holding out on showing us a lot of the new designs for this generation. And I think it's crazy that we haven't even had the starter evolutions officially revealed yet. But from what we have seen so far, I am pleased with these designs, and I love how they're visiting older Pokemon and giving them new evolutions, such as Farigiraf, which is a new evolution for Girafarig, and also the new Wooper form is just adorable. However, for me personally, I'd like to know what Pokemon I'm going to be using before going into the generation, and so far I haven't really seen too much that I'd actually end up using. So, of course, I gave in and looked at the leaks. And without spoiling anything, I will say that a lot of the designs this generation I think are really great. While there are some designs that I'm not too much of a fan of, I can acknowledge that I don't need to like every Pokemon design, and that even if I may hate it, other people will probably love those designs. And for me personally, all I need is about 6 Pokemon whose design I really like for my team. And this generation definitely has more than 6, so I'm not quite sure what my team will end up looking like by the end. But of the revealed Pokemon so far, I know I'm definitely going to be using Fuecoco as my starter, and then also going with Wooper and Sea Titan. Now perhaps the most interesting Pokemon we've seen so far are the Paradox forms that we got a glimpse of in the most recent trailer with Donphan. It seems like Scarlet will have Paradox forms showing these Pokemon from the past, whereas Violet will show Pokemon from the future. As we see, the past form Donphan looks extremely vicious, with a lot of spikes covering its body. And as for the future form of Donphan, I don't really like it. It just looks like a robotic version of Donphan, and I'm personally not a fan of that. I wish they would have done more with the future forms instead of just making it look like a robot version of the Pokemon. But that doesn't really matter much since I am definitely going with Scarlet, and I know there will definitely be people who appreciate the more robotic take that the future Paradox forms have. So overall, I feel like there's a great selection of Pokemon this generation, even if we haven't really had too many revealed. Now moving along to the other thing I'm most excited for, it's the new multiplayer aspect where you can actually play with your friends. I really hope that this feature works seamlessly and isn't like the Sword and Shield multiplayer where you could see other players in the open world, but they'd constantly be lagging around and starting and stopping as the system tried to catch up with what they're doing. But since it seems like this will be limited to only 3 of your other friends, I think that it should work a lot better here. I'm also curious to see how this will actually work, if it will let you explore the entire region with your friend and like have you be on one end of the region and your friend on the other and still be connected, or if it's only within certain areas that you'll actually be able to do this multiplayer, and if you stray too far it will disconnect you. I'm also interested to see if you can actually interact with your friends in this mode beyond just simple emotes, and if you'll be able to battle them right there and then, and if there's double battles available with AI trainers, if you'll be able to do them with your friends rather than using 2 of your own Pokemon. But I do think that this feature is a great addition, and it will definitely be interesting exploring a brand new region with friends along the way the entire time. But now it's time to get into some of the things that I'm more worried about with this generation, and the thing I'm most worried about so far is the Paldea region itself. Based on Game Freak's history with previous open area sort of designs, I'm not too sure they can actually manage to pull off this open world. Now I'll admit that I never bought the DLC for Sword and Shield, so my experience with the wild area is limited to just the base game version and not the areas in the DLC. So just going off of that, as well as the open areas in Legends Arceus, I haven't really been too pleased with Game Freak's implementation of open world areas in their mainline games. Now if you just look at the Pokemon franchise, then these open world areas have been amazing to explore so far. However, as someone who really loves playing Xenoblade games, seeing what Monolith has been able to accomplish with their open worlds and just how densely packed and full of things to do there are in those areas, it just blows anything Game Freak has ever accomplished with their open worlds out of the water. I feel like the areas in both Sword and Shield and Legends Arceus have felt rather sparse, and there's not really much to do. Like, you can explore any one of those areas within like an hour and have seen pretty much everything. You aren't really rewarded for exploration either. As in Legends Arceus, the only things to find were Unknown or Spiritomb spirits. And occasionally you'd find an alpha Pokemon, but there wasn't anything too special that you could find, really. And the wild area in Sword and Shield really didn't have anything worth finding in it. It just felt like these areas, the only things that you could find were new Pokemon, but you could also find those Pokemon in other areas as well. So discovering a more hidden location wasn't really that exciting. And there weren't really any other rewards in these areas, it was just catching Pokemon and that was it. And on top of that, I don't really think the visual design with these areas have been too strong in Pokemon games either. They're not bad by any means, but they just sort of feel like generic areas, especially in Sword and Shield, and Legends Arceus had a couple unique places, but for the most part it all just sort of felt kinda generic. I'm really hoping that the Paldea region will have a more unique and varied look to it, and that there will actually be more to do in the open world other than just catching Pokemon and battling trainers. And on top of that, I hope that Game Freak has actually learned how to properly optimize their games for an open world setting, as the most disappointing thing about Legends Arceus to me was how poorly it ran on the Switch. And again, seeing what Monolith has done with the Xenoblade series, it definitely isn't the Switch's fault why Legends Arceus ran so bad. I mean, there's really no excuse for how terrible the pop-in was in that game with like large objects like the side of mountains. And there were also issues with the grass and the shadows of trees reflecting off the water. There were just tiny technical details in Legends Arceus that would constantly remove from the immersion of the game, I found. And I'm hoping that they've figured out a way to sort of get rid of those, and we can actually have a more immersive experience in the Paldea region. But this is Game Freak we're talking about, and they are notoriously bad for not knowing how to properly optimize their games. So I'm not getting my hopes up in that regard, as I expect a lot of the issues that plagued Legends Arceus will also be present here in Scarlet and Violet. So while I'm really hoping that this will be the most immersive region we've ever had, I'm not getting my hopes up too high for it. But now we get to the things that have really disappointed me in this generation, the first of which being that it seems like this game still won't have voice acting in it, as a lot of the trailers have made it seem like there will be voice acting, with the first couple trailers having voiceover that they make seem like is coming from the characters in the game, and one of the trailer reveals for a gym leader had full Japanese voice acting and was completely animated. I feel like for a series as large as Pokémon, there's really no excuse for them to lack voice acting at this point. Especially with Pokémon being the highest grossing media franchise in the world, and the release of every Pokémon mainline game always sells millions of units. And the reason why I think they refuse to implement voice acting is due to time constraints, as it would likely add a lot more time for them to have to translate all of the text, and then hire voice actors and do the recordings and then implement those recordings into the game. But just seeing that trailer with the voice-acted gym leader, while I did find the voice acting to be extremely annoying, it just added so much more life and personality to the character than they have just standing there with text boxes and no voice acting at all. Voice acting would definitely enhance the experience, but it's just so disappointing to see them continue to refuse to implement it. I mean, even most indie games at this point can afford to include voice acting, and I think the Pokémon franchise is the only big AAA game series that still doesn't have voice acting in any of their mainline games. And if this game continues the trend of having completely silent characters, then, again, there's no reason for it at this point. I feel like there's a lot more benefit to be gained from having voice acting in Pokemon games than skipping it in order to meet a deadline. I mean, seriously, Scarlet and Violet are already the second games we're having this year, with Legends Arceus having come out earlier in January. I think that Game Freak and the Pokemon Company can definitely afford to stagger out these releases more to include things like voice acting and just polish up their games in general. There's really no need for such strict deadlines at this point. And I think a lot of people would rather have a more polished game than having a game every year, or now apparently 2 games every year. Almost 3 games, I guess. Has it even been a year since Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl came out? Like, I think it's very close to around when they released, so it's been almost like 3 games released within a 12-month span, which is just crazy. But moving along, now we have the one thing that I am most disappointed by in this generation, and it's honestly the new gimmick of this generation, being terastallization. I just don't care at all for this gimmick. All it really does is change the typing of your Pokemon and make them like crystal-like when it happens. There's nothing that really interests me about it. It seems to be a lot like Dynamaxing from Sword and Shield, where you have to like find these special types of Pokemon in raid dens, but even in Sword and Shield I didn't really care about those because, well, Every generation now, Pokemon introduces this new gimmick only to have it completely removed in the next generation. So in Sword and Shield, when you had to try and find these super rare Gigantamax forms, I didn't really bother with it because I just figured that after Mega Evolution and Z moves, Dynamax and Gigantamaxing would be completely removed in the next generation. And sure enough, that seems to be the case, as we haven't seen any sign of Dynamaxing in this new generation, and I'm sure that Terrestrialization will be pretty much exactly the same. Once the next generation rolls around, all of those rare Terra-type Pokemon that you have found will be completely useless, as Terrestrialization won't even be a thing in the next generation. And because of that, I just don't see any reason to waste time trying to find these rare Terra-type Pokemon in raid dens when it's going to make absolutely no difference next generation, as Terrestrialization won't be a thing anymore. And I feel like this is one of the things that is hurting the Pokemon franchise the most. People really loved Mega Evolution, and it's the only one that's lasted more than the generation it was introduced in. And then after that, it seems like they've just been taking certain aspects of Mega Evolution and sort of splitting them up into their own gimmicks. Z moves were just really powerful versions of moves that could only be used once a game, and sort of mimicked the power that Mega Evolved Pokemon had. And then Gigantamaxing was pretty much the same as Mega Evolution, except it was limited to only 3 turns, and any Pokemon could Dynamax. And now this Terrestrialization just seems to be taking the type change that some Mega Evolutions had and applying it to all Pokemon. And while I'm sure that it will make a huge impact in the competitive scene for this generation, I personally don't really care about battling competitively, and as far as just going through the main story goes, I don't think the games are going to be hard enough to justify even using this mechanic. I do think it will be interesting to see enemy trainers using it, but for me personally, I don't see much of a reason to try using it. I also find the new Terrestrialization forms to be rather underwhelming overall, as they're just a crystal-like version of the Pokemon with a really silly hat that indicates what type they'll be. I do think that Terrestrialization is a better gimmick in my opinion than Z moves, but I do feel like Z moves and Terrestrialization are easily the worst gimmicks that have been introduced into the mainline series, at least as far as my interest goes, because I know for sure that Terrestrialization will make a huge impact in the competitive scene. But again, that's not really what interests me in these games, and personally I'd rather see new forms and evolutions introduced in these gimmicks rather than having them turn into these crystallized paperweights. So now that we've gone over what I love about this generation, what I'm sort of hesitant on, and the things I hate about it, I just want to quickly go over the one thing I really hope they manage to nail this generation, and it's one thing I feel has seriously been lacking ever since the jump from 2D into 3D, which is the actual post-game of these games. As I feel like ever since X and Y, the post-games have been really lacking in Pokemon, and I hope that Scarlet and Violet finally manages to change that. I mean, recently the only thing it seems like there is to do in the post-game is either battle competitively or do shiny hunting. And then they usually add the obligatory area where you can catch every legendary Pokemon now, but that's it as far as post-game usually goes. There is sometimes some sort of story, but it's honestly rather underwhelming compared to what we've had in the past. I mean, if anything, I'm really hoping they actually bring Looker back for the post-game story this time, as we haven't seen anything from him since Sun and Moon. He's been completely absent ever since the jump to the Switch, and personally I've always looked forward to seeing more of Looker ever since he was introduced in Pokemon Platinum. So my greatest hope for this game is that we do see Looker back in some sort of post-game story, or just get a post-game story in general that's actually interesting, as I feel like the one with Sword and Shield was rather lacking and I was never interested enough to actually finish it, and then the Legends Arceus post-game just sort of felt like they took the ending of the game and then made it into the post-game. So what I'm hoping for is a completely unique post-game that stands alone from the main story, while also giving you more to do and sort of expanding upon this region. I just seriously hope there's more to do than just shiny hunting and competitive battling in the post-game, as that's all that's really been offered. And even as far as competitive battling goes, they've really dropped the ball on the battle facilities and sort of just tried to replace it with online tournaments.
And there you have it, my final thoughts on Pokémon Scarlet and Violet before the official release date tomorrow. But what do you think? Are you excited for this latest Pokémon generation? And which version do you think you're going to get? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.